Hi, I'm Sophie from Random House. Welcome. We're going to be going live momentarily with Conor Knighton, CBS Sunday Morning correspondent and author of Leave Only Footprints. And we're just going to be getting him momentarily live with us. And I think we see him right here. So just hold on one second.
Good morning. How you doing?
Good morning. Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good. How are you holding up in quarantine and everything?
I put a wall of postcards of the national parks up to remind me of where I once was and where I will be again one day. But yeah, I'm doing all right.
That looks absolutely lovely. Well, it's so great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
Is it a little strange for you to be on the other side of the interview?
I do not like it one bit. So
I assume you're probably getting a little bit used to it through your publicity for the book tour and everything.
Yeah, I've been doing a few podcasts. I mean, it's interesting how seamless that can continue. It's nice to be face to face with someone, but a lot of that you can do remotely. And so, yeah, it's been interesting to have talks. I did a podcast yesterday with a wilderness hunting focused podcast, a very different take on the parks than or a different perspective than I would have had. But it was a really interesting conversation. So excited to talk to you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So just for everyone joining us, we're here with Conor Knighton, who is a correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning, and he's here to talk about his book, Leave Only Footprints, which just came out. So first, I just wanted to ask you, so in 2006, you spent all your time on the road traveling to all of America's national parks, and what inspired you to make that trip?
Yeah, so 2016 actually, not 2006. It feels
oh my
at
God.
this point.
Sorry.
It feels no. Well, and time has lost all meaning at this point. So
it feels literally.
Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago, but a slightly more recent journey than that. And so 2016 was the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, and so I guess that provided the idea for the trip. But the inspiration actually came from some events in my life back in 2015. I had grand plans for the next year. I was planning to get married. At some point, that engagement was called off in 2015, much to my surprise and at that time heartbreak. And so I was sort of left in a weird way, kind of like I am right now, sitting at home a lot in sort of a self-imposed kind of self-quarantine. And so I needed to do something. I needed to get out of that apartment. My professional life was also kind of stalled at that point. And so one of my friends had suggested I could benefit from a change of scenery. And I do not think they meant every national park in the country over the course of a year. I way overcorrected in that department, but that's ultimately what I did. I'd seen a news article about the upcoming centennial of the Park Service. And at the time, I was doing some freelance reports for CBS Sunday Morning, which is one of the rare types of shows on TV that might actually do a piece about the parks or maybe even a few pieces. And so I started to think, well, what if we did a year's worth of pieces and wrote this outlandish email, especially considering I didn't even really work for them. I sort of worked for them back then. But ultimately, they said yes. And I was trying to emphasize in that pitch that the parks have the same kinds of stories that we would have aired in any year on Sunday morning, stories of food and family and art and architecture. And so I think they wisely decided to not do all of them. Honestly, we couldn't have done all of them for the show. So we did about a third for the broadcast. And then that's when I decided that I would pick up the rest on my own. If we're going to Alaska, where there are 8 national parks and we're doing 3 for the show, I'm going to do those other 5, and stay out on the road, take the money that I've been using to live full time in LA. And supplement this, partial work journey, just because it seemed like an easier headspace to be in. It seemed like a cleaner premise. And honestly, I don't think we'd be talking right now if I was the guy who went to a third of the parks.
Yeah.
if you go to all of them, all of a sudden that's a book.
Maybe it's not quite as catchy a title.
Yeah,
I went to a third of the national parks.
That's it. My Acadia to Congaree journey
Some
through
of them.
The first part. Yeah.
And, a question I already had prepared, but we're already seeing streaming in from people is, do you have a favorite national park?
It's so hard. I really should just come up with a better answer to that question because it's one I get a lot.
Fake it if you don't have one.
I don't, but I think it would be so clear that I would be faking it because 10 seconds later I'd be talking about another favorite. It's easier for me to kind of point more towards favorite experiences, favorite parks. It's almost like favorite food's a very a hard question for me to
We'll
answer as
accept a
well.
top three. I think we'll accept a top three.
Okay. So Utah's now, I'm already going to cheat even just for my first one of those three. So number one
Okay, fine.
would be the 5 national parks in Utah are billed as the Mighty Five. And so that would be Zion, Bryce, Capitol Reef, Canyonlands, and Arches. And 2 of those I went to when I was 14. So my family's trip out west, it was the first time I'd ever been on an airplane. I grew up in West Virginia, and there is nothing about Bryce Canyon that looks remotely like West Virginia. They're both beautiful, both very different, but that opened my eyes to how just diverse the scenery in this country is, what the national parks offered. So those always hold a special place to me in my heart, and it's also a trip you could conceivably do all at once. You could hit those 5 as part of a 2-week family trip. One of my favorite experiences was at Volcanoes National Park in Hawaii. At some point, especially when you see them all in such a compressed time frame, you don't, it's never a competition, and you hate to think that like, oh, the sunset at Big Bend was slightly more spectacular than the sunset at Cuyahoga Valley or whatever. But there is nothing that compared to the lava at Volcanoes National Park. It's the only park that had that. And just seeing Mother Nature give birth, which is essentially what that is. You're seeing the newest land in the country being born right in front of you. You're feeling that heat. There was no parallel to that in any of the other parks, although it helped me appreciate a lot of the other parks because many of them were formed by volcanic activity. But when you're standing on the sand dunes of Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, that the eruption that set all of that in motion feels so far away, but you're seeing that happening, literally under your feet in Hawaii. And so that, if I was going to look back on like a 2-hour chunk of a 365-day year, that's the chunk that stands out to me most, just because it was so different than anything else I saw. And sadly, you can't see it right now. That volcano stopped erupting in the same way. I'm sure it will again, but if you were to actually take that trip right now, you wouldn't even see it. And that also kind of makes it feel special to me that like these are moments in time that like exist kind of only for you at this specific place in my life. So
That's incredible. Now, I was wondering, did that one make it on the show? And were there any that didn't necessarily make it on CBS that you really hope had made it on the show?
yeah, I mean, in a way, that's how the book came about, because when I started to do the pieces for CBS, my inkling was like, all right, for sure we'll do Yosemite, for sure we'll do Yellowstone. I didn't do either of those for the broadcast because pretty quickly I got interested in the ones I'd never heard of. When I looked down that list, I mean, if you're looking at these parks, like you've heard of the Grand Canyon, where the heck's Lake Clark? And so those started to jump out more to me just from a storytelling standpoint. I think if the first 10 seconds of a video is I'm here at Kobuk Valley National Park in Alaska, you've bought into that already. You're like, where is that? How have I never heard of it? And so I shifted more towards those for the broadcast, but inevitably at the 2/3 of the parks that I went to that were not for the show, I found that I could have done a Sunday morning story at any of them. And so when I realized that they were all equally interesting, I just had to pick at some point. I didn't have to pick with the book. And the book, I was able to really treat all of them as a total unit, and I think hopefully offer some perspective that I wasn't able to offer on the broadcast, where we were focusing on one park, one story. The advantage of going to all of them, and not just some of them, is that you start to see the threads that tie them together. And so in a chapter on forgiveness might include a story at Dry Tortugas National Park in Florida and a story at Petrified Forest in Arizona, because at both I found that they told very different but still thematically linked stories of forgiveness. And so, or stories of home, Mesa Verde in Colorado and Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. And so it's a long way of saying that like all of them I could have done for the show. And inevitably I would go someplace and be like, why did I pick this and not this fascinating like church camp at Lake Clark in Alaska, where there's veterans and their spouses who go there for rehabilitation. Like that could have been not just a story, it could have been a documentary. But I wouldn't often know those stories until I got there on the ground.
And for those of us city people, how many national parks are there here in the US?
Yeah, so it's actually changed even since I've done the book. I really spent the last like 3 months before publication being like, I love you, national parks, but please don't make a new one. Like, I want this to at least be topical. So there were 59 at the time that I did the journey. There are now 62, and so the epilogue. Yeah. But in between, but fortunately, I was able to include those in the book because even that 60-second one, I was still able to address. So I have, in that calendar year, I went to what was then all of the national parks. I've since been back to the 3 new ones, but there are 400 and I think it's 19 right now, units that the Park Service manages. So that would be everything from like Ellis Island to like Ben Franklin's bathroom or whatever. There's lots of like small, sometimes indoor, battlefields. So in most cases, the national parks are the more marquee kinds of locations, the Yellowstones, the Yosemites, wider stretches of wilderness. Again, that's not always true, but what the distinction that they all share is that they have to be created by an act of Congress. So a president can make a national monument. A park has to involve an act of Congress. And so it was for me just an easier way to focus that journey was to say, all right, I'm going to go to those. And I mean, 59, there's more parks than there are weeks in a year. So it was barely possible to hit them all, but still doable, although I had to be very careful about, where I was spending my time, how I was structuring that route.
For those of you who are just joining us, we're talking to Conor Knighton, CBS Sunday Morning correspondent and author of Leave Only Footprints, which just came out. I'm wondering how your love of travel started. Were you always sort of an explorer, an outdoorsy person, or did this sort of come about more recently?
I think that trip that I'd referenced out west with my family really played a big role in that. I mean, we did a lot of my love of nature, I can trace back to, hikes I was taking when I was 2 or 3 out our backyard. I mean, West Virginia is beautiful, it's rural, and so there's lots of trails that we didn't have to work too hard to get to. But the travel sort of kicked in like late in high school, early college. And then in a way, I felt like I was making up for lost time. There were all these places I wanted to see, and that's I was doing that recreationally long before I ever tricked anybody into paying me to do it for a career.
That's how we all feel in book publishing with reading,
right?
So.
Yeah. So now it's great that I get to do it for work. Although sometimes that's meant that I will often find ways to go back to places that I wasn't experiencing recreationally. When you're doing a produced TV story someplace, you're not having the tourist experience. You're not going on the hike necessarily you want to go to. So a lot of my favorite parks over the course of this year were the ones that I was doing for fun. When all that was on my agenda was explore Pinnacles National Park. That's all I had to do. I didn't have to worry about getting a good sound bite. Those ended up being a lot more fun to me. And what was great about the book is I was able to go back to several of them to maybe do a little bit more of the research that I wasn't doing when I was just having fun. But that travel kicked in my teen years, and I don't think it's going away. I mean, I think the proof of that is that I am in an Airbnb right now. This is not where I live. I have not had a permanent address since 2016.
So that is a little tip that was given to me from your publicist, that this is the longest you have been in one place since 2015. How are you holding up?
Who would have guessed it would take a pandemic to get me to stay in one place? And honestly, I have been looking forward to finally paying a utility bill again and staying put. It's just I would have never guessed that this is how that would happen.
Right.
So this is kind of like the worst of both worlds, because the advantage of staying in one place, and honestly something that I've missed in my life, is like the social element of that. You get to go to your friend's birthday party, things that I'm missing when I'm out on the road, but none of those things are happening right now. So so now I'm just staying in one place, but none of the added social benefits.
There's no FOMO right now.
Right, yeah, none.
There's none.
So I'm doing fine with it. It's kind of nice to slow down some, and it's been fun to see. People will send me pictures sometimes of them reading the book in their backyard or in their bedroom or whatever, something that's kind of keeping their attention through quarantine when people have a lot of time to read on their hands. And I'm flattered that anybody's reading it. It's also cool to me to see like a physical thing out in the world. TV doesn't work that way. And so the idea that this is something concrete that like exists in people's hands who I will never meet has been really gratifying and cool to see that those pictures come back.
And this answer might be a little bit different now given the state of the world, but what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing our national parks?
I mean, in a weird way, they're doing great right now, which is having a reset from humans. So since most of them are currently closed, it's sad for us who don't get to visit them. But I'm sure the Everglades is happy to take a bit of a breather from human traffic because we continue to be both the biggest challenge facing the parks and also the biggest potential savior of them. They like it is human, both private citizens and lawmakers who have created the parks, and it's just making sure they continue. But the overarching potential downside, I guess, that is affecting all of the parks is climate change. John Jarvis, who was the 18th director of the Park Service, he was the active director when I was doing this trip, mentioned that climate change is by far the greatest threat facing the integrity of the national parks that we have ever seen. I saw it firsthand at Glacier National Park, where there will be no more glaciers potentially within a decade. But its effects are as powerful, but just sometimes harder to see at a park like Joshua Tree that may soon have no more Joshua trees because they grow at a specific elevation. And so certainly they're underfunded. Diversity is a big challenge with the parks in terms of attracting a more diverse audience, having a more diverse employee base. But climate change is hitting them all simultaneously, and that's also the same. That's the same issue for Los Angeles and Manhattan. So it's not unique to the parks. It's just that the parks are these laboratories where it's easier to see that. I think you can sometimes forget that it's happening when you're walking down the street in Miami, but when you're seeing that glacier melt and you're looking at a picture 20 years earlier where there's walls of ice that aren't there. So that overcrowding is also another one. And that's a mixed blessing because it's nice. Visiting the parks is a good thing. I'm happy if anybody's spending a day in the park. It's how we visit them and how we manage that visitation at some of those popular ones I mentioned, like Zion and Bryce. They're really trying to figure out how they manage the crowds. Do they do permitted entry? They could raise the price, but that's not really what the parks are about. That would certainly, there's a market rate. At some point, if you charge enough, you can make the numbers go down and make more money. But that's not why we have the parks.
That's actually leads me into a really great question from right here from Crown, which sort of gets into, I'd love for you to elaborate, which is, what park would you recommend for someone traveling solo for the first time? But maybe you could elaborate a bit on, and how would you recommend that someone visiting for the first time could do so in a really responsible and respectful way as well?
Sure. So for a first time, in a way you'd be peaking early, but if you went, like Yellowstone is well known for a reason. It's got a little bit of everything. I can give an unqualified recommendation for that park because whatever you like will be there. Whereas like Biscayne National Park in Florida is beautiful, but you kind of need a boat or scuba lessons or something. It's mostly water. That park is 95% water. But Yellowstone, Yosemite, because those are also a little bit more developed parks, that if you're not REI camper extreme, backpacker, there are a variety of ways of even finding accommodation in some of those parks. Some of my favorites, like those parks in Alaska, like Lake Clark, you really do need to know how to pitch a tent. You need to bring your own food. You need to cook your own food. There's a cafeteria at Yosemite. Unfortunately, there's a Starbucks at Yosemite right now. And I guess that's the trick. So when you go to those larger places, that is also where our impact is being felt more. So in terms of how to experience them responsibly, not to be like too cute about it, but like leave only footprints is good advice. Like that's that it's just minimizing your impact. It's something as seemingly simple, although you'd be surprised how many people don't do it, of picking up your trash. But also, I've noticed social trails, which is what you call it when someone like takes a path that wasn't meant to be taken. So in a park, something, a switchback or whatever, really just trying to stay away from those. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody else, because sometimes it looks like it leads to a better view, or you get to bypass, a longer stretch of the trail, but those really are damaging to the resources. They create erosion that shouldn't be happening. The trails that have been made are there for a reason. So it's just kind of staying on those. And then getting there early. That's my biggest tip, is that like, and boy, that's a hard one for me to follow. It's hard for me to do this chat with you right now. It's 8 a.m. Pacific time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, the coffee with Conor happened like pretty hard at like 7:30 to get ready. But if you can, like get there as the gates are opening. You know, you will always have a better time. And the difference between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. is a vast difference in terms of, you know, the wildlife that you'll see and the people that you won't see. And so if you can wake up earlier and get there sooner, that's always what I'd recommend.
I think we have time for just one more question, and I would actually love to go off what you just said, which is a personal one as an animal lover, but I would actually love to hear about some of the wildlife that you did see while you were researching the book.
Yeah. So everything from a 1-inch long fish at Death Valley National Park, the Devil's Hole pupfish, to a 1,000-pound bear at Katmai National Park. Yeah, the 1,000-pound bear left a little bit more of an impression. But that's the Roosevelt elk at Olympic, the mosquitoes at Congaree. I mean, from the great and the small, you are always out with those. But the bears in Alaska really stood out. If you've ever seen any video of bears eating salmon jumping up a waterfall, chances are that was shot at Katmai National Park. It's just a very reliable wildlife setting, not because of anything artificial that people are doing, just, you know, for thousands of years, these salmon have always, you know, taken this route back home up Brooks Falls, and the bears have figured that out. And so it's what they call a predictable eruption. And so they just make sure to hang out there. And it's like one of those conveyor belt sushi restaurants where like you just stand there and you're like, okay, salmon, salmon, salmon.
That's great.
So yeah, if you're looking for that, I mean, that's why I recommend Yellowstone to folks as well, because you can't miss the bison. You may or may not see a wolf, but it's impossible to miss there. But sometimes the sightings that are harder are more impactful. Pinnacles National Park in California is one of the few places where you can see a California condor, super endangered. I think there's 300 or some left flying around. And I was so sure I saw one. I was hiking, and then all of a sudden it's there, and I'm taking all these pictures of it. And it's thrilling because you know how rare that is, and you feel blessed to be able to see it. This jogger comes down the trail, and he's like, hey, you know that's a raven, right? And I did not know it was a raven. I had taken about 50 pictures of a raven that is a black bird that is just much smaller and much further away. So I still have not seen a condor, so I can't necessarily recommend that. But there's almost like I'm not a hunter, but in a way, I'd imagine there's some weird parallels to like what it feels like to hunt, because you're on the lookout. You're like, okay, I've got to find this bird or that you know, that type of fish or whatever. And so they've all got them, which is nice. So sometimes it's a beetle that's like crawling across a sand dune, but in a way that can feel as special and magical as a herd of bison at Wind Cave.
I have to admit, it has been sitting in an apartment for so many weeks. It has been just wonderful to talk to you this morning about nature and everything. It's been so comforting. Conor, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who watched, thank you so much also for joining us. His book is Leave Only Footprints, and it is out now everywhere books are sold. Thank you.
Hey, great talking to you. Have a good day.
Great talking to you. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.